So this may be the day that I get that intake manifold off. First thing I've done is I've turned the crank with a breaker bar to what appears to be top dead center. Somebody's made a mark near the zero, so I went in between that. The rotor seems to be close. I put the number one position to be about here, a little bit more clockwise than this one, but as long as I photograph it as I'm doing now and put it back the same way, I think I'll be okay. There are a few wires I have to remember to take off. Well, just one basically, I guess, is a ground wire, which is not really a necessary wire, but something I put in because I was experimenting with the different things on the distributor, and it was putting my ground in jeopardy. So there's that ground, and then there's the negative from the coil, which I'll remove. Then I'll take off the clamp at the base of the distributor and see about taking it out. This is my first try at doing something like this. If I get it, then we'll move on to the carburetor. Yeah, for some of you newbies, you might appreciate seeing another newbie take out a distributor. Let's see what works and what doesn't. I've removed the whole down clamp, the wires, and now I imagine I just need to lift it out. If putting it back in, it's not going to be fun. If I can get it out without too much hassle, I'll be kind of happy. The vacuum advance hose was left on, so alright. Doing my best not to make a dog's breakfast of this too. And here's what we're left with. I was going to say stuck with, but here's what we're left with. I'm going to try not to move a damn thing and just try to glide it back in. This was facing about at 2 o'clock, 2:15. I made a mark actually. Well, I guess it moved because I had marked it exactly here. Yeah, the gear must have moved. So now I remember when I put it in, I'll bet you the gear is going to come back. I bet you the rotor is going to turn with the gear. But that's it for now. Next is the carburetor. Now after the distributor is safely in a box somewhere, I decided just to pull the 4 spark plug wires and just move them out of the way, move the cap out of the way with it. Since they have the little plastic pass-through happens to have them in order, there's no need for me to worry about it. They're in there tight. And I'll just begin removing the valve covers, and maybe I'll be able to salvage the cork gaskets. I put them on maybe 1,000 miles ago, if that, but sometimes the heat can make them stick and whatever, and I have a new set coming in case. Oh, we'll see. I removed a couple of other things. I took the element out of the coolant sensing, the coolant temperature sensor, and I'm going to remove the resistor from the oil pan, and I have most of this wiring loomed up together, so it should be fairly neat and easy just to move it aside. To disconnect anything. I've got to remember keep these little screws and bolts. Yeah, so that's going to be basically out of the way. I don't want the element to get dirty. I want to wrap that bag with some tape. I still needed to remove the hand choke cable, and finally the carburetor was lifted off and put aside. I tend to be more careful than I used to be, taping over the hole in the intake. I don't want anything to get in there. I'm not used to doing the job. I may stay like this for a day in between sessions, and I don't want anything to happen. So keeping it taped up, it just seems like the minimum. As you know, I did the same on the carburetor itself, and I'm going to try to keep everything clean. Now it looks like it's time to move straight over to the valve covers. So I'll take the valve covers and then the radiator hoses, or at least the radiator hose, the remaining one, the upper main radiator hose, off. With that and the valve covers off, there's a throttle base right at the end near the firewall. There's 2 bolts holding that on, and that basically is the base for the low car throttle cable. And that's got to come off eventually, although I could yank the whole thing out together. Wouldn't probably make much difference. It might just be easier to handle if the carburetor studs and the throttle cable base were off. I'm thinking of painting the unit before I put it back on. It looks pretty sad, so I may do that. And there she is. The push rods, the rocker bridge, all visible. Now, a very intelligent builder on the internet informs that the rocker bridge need not be completely removed. He says to slack each one a little at a time so as not to cause any distortion. And at some point it'll be loose enough that you can move it aside and grab these push rods or push tubes. And there are 8 per side. You've got to have a cardboard box with holes waiting for it, numbered 1 through 8 on both sides, and make sure they go back in the same place, in the same spot exactly as they were. That, I think I can handle that. But I got to tell you, I've done the valve cover gaskets before, but I've never taken the intake off. There's no real excuse for failure because I've got plenty of space in the back of the engine. And as I mentioned in a previous video, I have every intention of bringing the engine forward an inch if I can, an inch and a half if I can get away with it. And as that occurs, well, of course, the transmission will become more loose in the tunnel because the larger part of the transmission will be moving forward. Imagine a funnel being pulled out of a hole. All of a sudden you have some slack, you have some loose around the edges. So by moving the engine forward, I hope to create enough slack in the engine tunnel and between the transmission and the engine tunnel to lift the engine slightly, giving me more clearance for my headers. I may not lift it directly. I may lift the back end a bit and level it out. Right now it sits at 5 degrees of lean. I've seen cars closer to 1. I'm going to do some research on that and see how I can make this happen, because effectively just by lifting the back end, in other words changing or diminishing the degrees of what am I looking for? Making it more level. The headers, which are will shoot a foot on the other side, the collectors, which tend to drag, are about a foot past the valve cover. And by straightening out the engine, leveling it off a little bit, I can also really lift that from the asphalt and give it quite a bit more clearance. So there are a couple of ways I can go. If I was just to change the degrees right now, well, I'd hit the tunnel, the firewall tunnel opening. That's just not enough. I have to move it up forward. And that's going to be a challenge. This is going to eat up the month. I was giving myself the month of April to do this, but I started around the 19th or 20th of May to take things apart, of March, and I'm hoping to get as much done before May starts. So perhaps May will be the month of putting everything back together, painting, polishing, and making sure everything is as spot on as I can afford to do it or have the know-how to do. So on to the next valve cover. Well, back to shaky handheld mode here. I wanted to get pretty close. So now the left driver's side valve cover has been removed. Look at the mess. It's not pretty. Needs a good vacuuming just to be able to work on it. It's very strange. A lot of finger marks, I guess. And then there's that measurement I took, and I've got to make sure to record it because I may not be able to keep it, especially if I paint. If I paint the unit, I measured to that line. Measured and it looks like that piece of steel is actually pointing to it, 5 1/4 inches to the firewall. This is just as a reference because I may never have this back in exactly the same spot, and if I do move it forward, I want to be able to keep track of how much I've moved it forward, as much for bragging rights as for just the general information purposes. Now, before I remove the transmission, I put this block here in case there was a question of the engine tilting to a certain degree and harming the motor mounts, which are held by one bolt on each side. I just wanted to stay pretty even. But that block went in fairly loosely, and now it is tight. And now it's in there. So I would assume that my mark is no longer 5 1/4, but I'm going to verify. And with this video, well, I'll have reference. I'll have a reference in knowing that knowing right at the end of the K is where the end of the K of Edelbrock is pretty much where my mark comes in, and I can reference this video for more exact measurements.